The transmission arrived like a tide breaking metal, sudden, cold, and impossible to ignore. One heartbeat I was beneath the freighter's belly, elbows deep in a coolant manifold smelling of burnt oil and metal. The next, I was staring at the comm console as a voice, not human, not quite sound as anyone I'd known, spilled across the channel and into the cramped shop with the force of an ocean. "I want a child from you," she said. The tools in my belt rattled like bones in a jar. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds. If this story has already captured your heart, let us know where you're following from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected twists, emotional reconciliations, or new beginnings, subscribe and stay connected. Now, back to the story. For a long second, I thought it was Jax messing with me. Jax loved pranks almost as much as he loved the salvage haul. Would paste a dented hollow of Captain Vel onto the mess feed just to see the cadets squirm. I blinked grit from my lashes and scrubbed oil off my hands with the back of my sleeve. The familiar rhythm of grease and grind trying to steady the way the words had upended me. The voice was wrong for prank calls, too layered, too patient. It folded over itself like silk threaded with light. Somewhere beyond the freighter's thin hull, something older than human radio etiquette reached in and asked for something impossibly intimate. "You got a joke, Calder?" Jax asked, voice high on the comm. He was somewhere aft, probably hunched over the harpoon winch, his breath always a punctuation in the ship's chatter. I opened my mouth, closed it. The voice poured on, a hush that filled the room and my chest with cold and sweetness both. "My name is Osral," she said, "Queen Osral of the Olanite. I speak to you because there are needs that cannot be met by those in my court. Your species, you carry what we lack. I want a child from you." The words should have been scientific jargon, a diplomatic memo, a polite request couched in treaties and biosample forms. Instead, they landed like an accusation and a prayer at once. I could imagine, ridiculous, hallucinatory, the Ulanite, filaments that rippled like living ribbons, bodies that gleamed in colors that didn't belong to any spectrum my eyes had charts for. But a queen asking me, Eli Calder, mechanic, oil-stained knuckles, a father figure to a crew of misfit salvagers, felt like a wrong note in a song I'd thought I knew. "You picked the wrong tin can," I said, trying to make my voice level. My hand hovered above the console, as if I could press the sound back into the void. "We're barely keeping the turbines from eating themselves." "You keep your hands clean enough to mend iron and steel," she answered. "You keep people alive with your little miracles. Those small mercies matter." There was a tilt in her words that I didn't catch at first, an ache coiled into syllables. "I offer protection for you and your kin. I offer technologies that can keep your lines safe. In return, we ask for the possibility of continuation." The comm hummed with static. Behind me, the freighter's bulk pressed against the black like an old dog against a cold night. My mother's face, lined, impatient, fierce, flashed against the memory of her telling me not to take risks. My sister's laugh, the kids on the outpost hovering around my bench waiting for stories about planets I'd never seen. I had a life measured by bolts and bartered credits, not by destinies that cross species or star systems. "Why me?" I heard myself ask. It sounded small against the enormity of the offer. "You have the lineage we require," Ajral said. "You survived an event that should have been fatal. Your blood carries mutations of resilience. We studied you, quietly, carefully. You are not a politician's favorite. You are an honest instrument. We believe honesty breeds strength." The honesty line made me flush with embarrassment. I was a mechanic with calluses and an aversion to authority. The things Azrael had apparently noticed were the small, stubborn virtues, fixing what others called junk, staying when someone needed you, not lying when it would be easier. But none of that prepared me for the bargaining tone that followed. "We can protect them," she said. "There are human elements that will not allow our survival to go unanswered. They will hunt for any tool. Accept, and you will have guardians, cloaking nodes, resources. Decline, and you will face inconvenience. Your family might be questioned. We have watched what power does to those who ignore its avenues. We offer partnership rather than coercion." The edge in that sentence, coercion, implied like a raised blade, settled into my gut. My life had taught me to mistrust offers that sounded too good. Salvage crews who promised gold and left you on a rock. Corporate envoys who smiled while they rearranged your ledger to make you indebted. Azrael's promise smelled simultaneously of salvation and leverage. My first instinct, one that came from waking up on the wrong side of the galaxy more than once, was to step back. "I can't," I said. "I can't give you. This is ridiculous. I'm not breeding stock, queen or no. We survive by sticking together, by staying alive. I won't use my family as a bargaining chip." Silence. For a while, the only sound was the freighter's engines thrumming like a distant heart. I could feel the crew watching for whatever breach would follow. Jax's voice popped onto the channel, lower now, filled with the curiosity that kept him awake at night and got him into every trouble we ever mended. "He's serious?" he wanted to know. On the comms display, lines of data scrolled, unfamiliar linguistic patterns, a header no freight company had clearance to decrypt. Someone had reached wide and pulled something tight around our little ship, and the pressure was starting to show. Azrael's voice returned, and when she spoke, the sound was closer, as if she had stepped into the corridor. "You may refuse," she said, "but understand the cost. There are factions among your species who will harvest what they can from contact. Your refusal will not end their interest. It will only make them more dangerous. We can help you protect your own. We can keep your family out of sight. We can erase certain traces. We can make you indispensable to the future." She used the word future like an invocation. The reality of it, politics stretched over hydroponic farms, secret colonies tucked in asteroid belts, human agencies willing to trade ethics for advantage, made my scalp prickle. I had grown up on stories of first contact diplomacy and the quiet, ugly ways governments could weaponize a miracle. The Ulanat might be pleading, but they were not powerless. Their filaments could probably do things my brain had no vocabulary for. And they had allies among human powers who liked the idea of calves for future wars. "No," I said again, "I won't be turned into leverage." The calm felt suddenly thin, paper against a storm. Jax muttered, and the sound of boots scraped the steel deck. Around the freighter, space threaded in a slow, indifferent arc. It would be so easy to run, cut the drives, slip into a courier lane, become a rumor. If I ran, would they follow? Would my mother be questioned in the way Azrael hinted? The choice grew teeth and bit. "You do not run well," Azrael said softly. I wondered how she had read that. Some cultural pattern in my voice, a diagnostic echo embedded in the resonance of English. "You fix what others toss. You bind the frayed threads. That is why I chose you." The selection as flattery or as threat, both, made my gut hollow. For a mechanic from a rust-breathing salvage crew, the idea of being chosen by an alien queen was absurd and terrifying. It shifted the axis of everything I believed, that my work kept people alive, that the right choice was to keep people whole, and that pride and fear balanced each other on a razor wire. Now that wire vibrated with the weight of entire populations. "What do you need exactly?" I asked, because even a man face-to-face with absurdity wants to negotiate terms. People didn't ask for children without specifying the mechanism, the promises, the consequences. If this were some experiment, I had the right to know the variables. A child who carries high-grid markers, Ajral said, a gestation that will require rituals of both our cultures, technologies I can share, medicines I can provide. The process is intimate in ways your species respects as sacred and in ways ours regards as a covenant. It is not merely biology, it is lineage and policy and the hope that our people will not fade when the gene pool collapses. I will come to your ship if you agree. I will ensure secrecy and safety. I will allow you agency in ceremony. I pictured ceremony, and my mind scrambled for anchors. Weddings I'd mended a generator for, funerals where we patched the heat systems, births on remote stations where the midwife used duct tape and prayers. I was a man acquainted with the small, fierce moments when life and death tangled with metal and faith. Yet the notion of ritual with an alien monarch, of being a nexus for policy and biology, set my ribs to trembling. "We need time," I said. "Talk to my crew, talk to my family. You don't just—" "Time is a commodity we do not have," she interrupted. There was an urgency in her voice now, bare and raw. "A pathogen is altering our line. If we do not act, we will lose the capacity to bear children within a generation." There are places on the map, a world newly opened by a microlens in subspace, that can sustain both our peoples if hybrids can be made to carry the necessary enzymes. We cannot guarantee long-term stability without the genetic barcode of cross-species progeny. The words landed like a verdict. Somewhere between the Ulanat's extinction and my family's uncertain welfare, a problem scaled from personal to cosmic. I felt the ship spin on an axis I had never wanted to orbit. Either be part of a solution that could change the course of two species, or shrink into a narrower safety that still left others to die. The moral calculus felt obscene. "Why me, though?" I pushed, shorter than before. "You said you studied me. Who else? Why? Why pick a freighter mechanic in a salvage crew?" "Because you did not run," she said. "Because when your freighter suffered a hull breach near the Corin belts, you stayed to secure the children trapped in a sealed quarter. You stay when others leave. And because you carry a genetic anomaly, an old virus that your immune system neutralized and stored. It is rare. It may be essential. I do not know the human politics well enough to coax such a person forward without direct appeal. I appeal to you honestly." The memory she referenced hit like a blade. Years ago, a shuttle had slid off an orbital ring and we had pulled survivors through a ripped bulkhead. I had been younger then, hands bleeding, adrenaline a taste at the back of my teeth. A boy with a cracked skull had looked at me and smiled. I had made an oath then, never again to turn my back on a life that could be saved. The promise had been small, stubborn, human. The universe had turned it into a lever. You come, you offer protection, and you expect me to consent to something that could make my life a political chess piece? I said. "You think a queen's promise can pacify human agencies that view hybrids as opportunity?" "I think my resources can shelter your family," Ajral replied. "I think our need is real. I think you are not as powerless as you believe." She was right, and that was what scared me. Power can be kind, and cruelty often pretends to be salvation. I looked toward the corridor where the crew's shadows coalesced, each face a ledger of debts and hopes. Jax's jaw was set. My mother, if she knew, would tell me to be careful and then scold me for not being braver. Choices compressed into a hot, thin wire. Protect or flee. Save two species or dam the river and hope someone else builds the bridge. "I need to talk to the crew," I said finally. The word need was both shield and truce. You'll give us answers, how this works, what it costs. You won't, no memory edits, no threats. There was a pause, and in it I could imagine Ajral weighing the shape of my stubbornness. No edits, she said. No coercion beyond the reality of politics. If you choose to refuse after full disclosure, we will respect that. If you choose otherwise, we will begin gently. There will be guardianship for your people. I had always been a man of tools. I trusted bolts and measured tolerances because they obeyed simple laws. This proposition was a knotted tide of ethics, biology, and political expediency. It promised shelter and demanded a body as a fulcrum. I had to decide whether to be the person who kept sweeping the hull clear or to step out and become a hinge in a future that had no guarantees. The shop clock ticked, metal against metal, and the universe waited for me to pick a side. The shop clock kept ticking like an accusation. I told myself the decision wasn't mine to make alone, and yet, every time I imagined Ajral's voice softening into promises of protection, I felt the floorboards tilt as if the freighter were listing towards some unforeseeable shore. The crew gathered in the corridor, faces lit by ladder lights, silhouettes that had shared engines and smuggled meals for years, waiting for me to spell an impossible choice. The Ulanite queen had asked for a child. She had called me honest, like it was an instrument assessment. She had offered shelter and whispered threats in the same breath. Now the real work began, translating an interstellar ultimatum into language a salvage crew could understand. "All right," I said, clearing my throat. "We talk like we talk about an engine. Lay out the failure modes, the backup plans, and the maintenance schedule. No poetry." Jack snorted, but the tightness around his eyes told me he felt the gravity of the moment. He leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, the way he always did when deciding whether to be brave or reckless. Miri, our medic and moral center, stepped forward. She was small and fierce, the kind of person who stitched more than skin. She patched the crew's fear into something we could carry. She said, "No memory edits," Miri said, voice flat. "That means no tampering with consent." But she also said she can make us indispensable. How? What does that even mean? "It means resources," I said. "Cloaks, medicine, maybe safe passage." Ajral claims to have allies who can shield us from human agencies. But also, I swallowed, also it means politics. Being shielded by an alien queen isn't neutral. It paints a target. Murphy's, our pilot, kicked at a bolt. Targets are like rust. They get under your skin slow, and then they take you. How do we know she isn't lying? How do we know she isn't using us like bait? "Because she has to convince me," I said. "She wants me to consent. That gives us bargaining power. If she wanted to coerce, she would have done it already. She could have taken us while we slept. She hasn't." "That doesn't mean she won't," Jack said. "Choices made under duress aren't choices." Miri looked at me with a stare that said she would cut her own heart out if it saved a child. "Eli, you remember the Corin breach. If anyone is geared to handle something sacred and messy and human, it's you. But sacred and messy are the things that get used to justify horrors. I need to see the science." "Me too," Murphys said. "I need to know how this child will be born, what the rituals mean, what the medical fallout is. You don't take a life-altering procedure without knowing the aftercare." I nodded. It was a practical thing to ask for. Ajral's voice had been eloquent, but eloquence didn't equal transparency. We demanded diagrams, protocols, human and Ulanite witnesses. We demanded a neutral third party who could vouch for Ajral's promise, if such a creature existed between the politics. Ajral answered with a grace I had not expected. She agreed, reluctantly, and with the same tempered patience she used to speak about entire star systems. To meet with our crew in a neutral space, a trade buoy in the Valen corridor, One of those noisy market hubs that smelled of fried protein and old currency, where everyone's transactions were visible enough to be witnessed, but chaotic enough to discourage formal seizures. She would come in civilian form, an envoy, and bring a biologist, a human who had worked with the Ulanite for years and could explain the genetics. She offered a name, Jack said, leaning in. Dr. Han Mei. Works with those fringe labs near the outer rings. Not officially sanctioned, but not a black market quack. If she vouches for the process, maybe we have legs. The thought of an actual person standing between us and an alien queen steadied me. Agreements needed witnesses, and witnesses needed jurisdiction. If May came from the region's scientific community, perhaps she could tie Ajral's promises to something legally graspable. It wasn't safety, but it was a map. We argued like a crew savage in the name of survival. The debate flipped from strategy to the personal because it always did. Questions about my family spilled into the conversation. What would my mother face if we said no? If we said yes? Would she be moved into a secure Ulanat enclave? Would she be subjected to endless questioning by human agencies curious about hybrid genomes? That balancing of potential harm felt like walking on a knife's edge. You're asking me to choose between my home and a world I never promised to anyone, I said at one point, voice cracking. I grew up thinking my job was to keep the lights on. Now the lights are part of something bigger, and I'm supposed to decide whether my hands will make the bridge or whether I'll burn the planks. Miri stepped closer and put her palm to my shoulder the way she did when someone needed to be held still enough to think. You don't have to do this alone. Whatever you choose, we choose with you. But you must choose. Options that look like cowardice look like betrayal to others. That was the uglier truth. Inaction would strand us all in a maelstrom of other people's agendas. The idea that safety could only be bought with participation in a biologically fraught project turned my stomach. But inaction could also mean leaving the Ulanat to a slow fade and accepting a cruel calculus of species extinction that felt morally bankrupt. I asked the crew to list what they needed to believe. They wanted guarantees, protocols, and a timeline. They wanted Dr. Melias's backing and a neutral mediator, someone like an interstellar tribunal registrar or a trade consulate with power to enforce Azrael's promises if she reneged. They wanted to see the Ulanat's technologies, the medicines, the cloaking fields. They wanted to know whether the hybrid child would be threatened, mediatized, or weaponized. She offered guardianship, I said. That may mean personnel who can watch over our families. It could mean moving them into an enclave. It could mean giving us fail-safes in the event something, anything, goes wrong. We need to think about the child too, Miri said quietly, not just who benefits politically. What if the child suffers? What happens if the child is used as a symbol, a bargaining point? We don't get to decide for them after the fact. Her words hit a chord. We weren't just bargaining over my life or my family's survival. We were deciding the fate of a being who didn't yet exist and whose rights we had to predict in a universe that didn't care for predictions. The moral weight fell like a stone in my chest. The meeting with Ajral at the Trade Boy was surreal and public. I walked into the crowded market in my grease-stained jacket, feeling exposed. Merchants hawked synth fruit and used flight boots, a chorus of languages layered over each other. In the midst of that human clamor, Ajral's contingent cut through like a silvery tide. She arrived with a human man beside her, Dr. Han Mei, more ordinary than I expected, with a tired smile and laboratory hands that had clearly seen as many mistakes as triumphs. Mechanic Eli Calder, Ajral said when she approached me. She was smaller in person than in my imagination. Her filaments had been tamed into a human-like form that shimmered at the edges, an aura like oil on the water. When she reached for my hand, the touch was warm and unplaceable, like the memory of rain. "Dr. May," I said, bowing a little because manners still mattered in public and because it eased some of the tension in my stomach. "Thank you for meeting us." May offered a folder. "Paper," archaic, but tangible enough to feel safe. She laid out the protocols with the clarity of someone who had seen the trajectory of promises and watched them bend into weaponry. The hybrid markers Ajral sought were complex, a sequence of immune responses integrated with ulinate enzymatics. The process would require biological contributions from both species and a gestational environment that could be partially synthesized. There were risks: rejection responses, neurochemical mismatches, potential for mutation. May was honest about probabilities, about what they didn't know. "We only know that your genome contains a rare retrovirus remnant," May said, tapping a page. "In most humans, it's inert. In Ellis's cohort, we detect an immune adaptation that neutralized that remnant and kept a portion of the virus's proteins as a mnemonic. That mnemonic could be the key to integrating our enzymatic pathway. But it's experimental, it's not clean." "Experimental?" Murphys echoed, incredulous. "That's a word for lab rats." "It's a word for frontier medicine," May corrected. "And that's what this is. A frontier. No one asked for this to be safe. All we can do is make it as less dangerous as possible and ensure no one uses the child as an asset." Ajral's filaments fluttered like a sigh. "We have borne witness to the slow extinguishing of our line," she said. "We cannot abide by passivity while the current takes us. If you consent to rigorous oversight. If you refuse, we still will search for other solutions. We request that you not betray the chance." Her candor, the way it lay flat and awful on the table, a species pleaded with a man from a rusting freighter, made my throat tight. Jax clenched his fists. Murphys looked like she wanted to vomit. Miri had gone pale but steady. "We need guarantees," I said, "because words feel like anchors when everything else seems liquid. Legal guarantees. A mediator who will stay with the child. Independent observers. Medical support lifelong. And we want the ability to pull out if the child is endangered or the process becomes weaponized." May hesitated, then nodded. "These are reasonable," she said. "I can secure observers and a clinician team, but I cannot bind political entities." "Ajral will have to persuade her allies to accept oversight." "Then show us your allies," Murphys said bluntly. "Names, documentation, agreements. If your protection is just a rumor, then the safety is fragile." Ajral met Murphys' gaze, and, for the first time, I saw a flicker of rawness that wasn't polished protocol. "There are human factions who support me," she said. "There are those who believe in our shared future. They are not all official. They are not all kindly. But they will stand guard." "That's not enough," Jack said. "You want us to trust you. Trust is built, not demanded." Ajral exhaled through her teeth. "You are right," Captain Jax called her. "Trust must be earned." The avatar of her filaments shimmered, and for a moment she looked less like a monarch and more like a woman asking at the edge of a cliff. "Allow us to begin in a limited trial. We will place guardians near your families. We will establish oversight. There will be transparency. Dr. Mai will remain independent, and we will sign a covenant witnessed by the tribunal registrar here in Valen." That last promise, tribunal witness, felt like a hinge. It did not erase the unknowns, it made them visible. It offered a framework where we could act and still hold someone accountable. It was the best fragile thing available to people who lived in the margins. When the meeting broke, we circled each other in the crowded market, voices low, bargaining not just for logistics, but for the moral architecture of a choice. My hands smelled of oil and stood up at the back of my neck like grooved iron when Ajral reached for my hand one last time, palm warm and novel. She did not touch me like ownership. She touched me like pleading. "Decide soon," she said. "The microlens will open the corridor wider in 5 cycles. We need time to prepare. We ask for your compassion and your courage." I left the trade buoy with a folder of legal papers, a list of names, and a gravity in my chest that made each step feel like a labor. The crew clustered around the airlock when we returned, a constellation of weary souls who had seen too many impossible choices and yet still woke to fix the engines. The council convened in whispers. Miri and May argued medical ethics, Jax and Murphy's argued security, and I listened to the chorus of fears and hopes colliding in a tiny room like tectonic plates. Night fell across the freighter with a heavy patience. I lay awake on the top bunk, watching the ceiling panels hum. Ajral's voice echoed in my head, and beneath it the memory of that boy trapped in the Koran breach, the way he'd grinned despite the blood on his lip. That grin had made me promise a small thing. Do not turn away from a life that could be salvaged. Now that promise had stretched until it bisected worlds. At 3 in the morning, when the ship's lights were low and the stars outside the hull seemed indifferent, Jax padded into my bunk room and sat at the foot of the bed. He didn't speak for a long time. When he finally did, his voice was soft, with an honesty I hadn't heard from him in years. "What scares you the most?" he asked. "That whatever I choose, the rest of our lives will fold into other people's plans," I said. "That I'll wake up one day and find the child we helped make is being paraded as a symbol or held like a bargaining chip. That I'll regret both moving and staying, and there'll be no room left for forgiveness." Jax gave a half laugh. "You're not built to be a symbol, Eli. You're built to fix things. Maybe that's the point. Maybe being human, being able to soften and hold and break and forgive, is what the universe is missing." "Maybe," I echoed, but the word was thin. The choice remained, heavy and terrible. In the end, we had to balance the weight of one life against the fate of many, and there was no calculus that didn't leave blood on the ledger. "You're not built to be a symbol, Eli. You're built to fix things. Maybe that's the point. Maybe being human, being able to soften and hold and break and forgive, is what the universe is missing." "Maybe," I echoed, but the word was thin. The choice remained, heavy and terrible. In the end, we had to balance the weight of one life against the fate of many, and there was no calculus that didn't leave blood on the ledger. Dawn tinted the bulkhead with a pale color that could almost have been hope. We had agreed to move forward to negotiate the covenant. We had set conditions that would, if the universe honored promises, keep us honest and accountable. Yet the pull of stakes remained. As the freighter readied to jump to a corridor where human and Ulanate politics braided like vines, I felt the tug of everything I had been taught. Protect your crew, protect your family, and for once, maybe protect a future that would ask more of us than any of us had bargained for. The act of stepping into the corridor was an act of surrender and defiance. It meant I could be a father in a way I hadn't planned, shaping a life that belonged to 2 species. It meant I could refuse and condemn others to slow extinction. It meant I could become a fulcrum for things bigger than bolts and burn-through. Or I could double down on a life measured in small mercies and refuse the world its investment. When the freighter slipped free of its berth and the stars smeared into lines, I stared at the place where the whole met the dark and thought of that child as both possibility and responsibility. The push and pull of the universe rearranged my inner geometry. If I was honest, and Ajral seemed to be asking for honesty, then I had to be honest with myself. I had always been a man who could not stand idly by while something breathed and needed a hand. The question had not been answered, not yet, but the gears were in motion. the covenant taking shape like a trenchant bolt feeding into uncertain thread. In the quiet hum of the engines, the choice waited for dawn to harden into decision. The first blow came not as violence, but as a quiet unthreading. A dossier slipped into my hands through Dr. May, pages that smelled faintly of antiseptic and old fear. "Read it in private," she said, her voice low, eyes not meeting mine. The folder was thicker than the brochures Ajral had shown at the trade bureau, legal affidavits, surveillance logs, testimonies. At the center, a file stamped with a government sigil I recognized only from whispered tales of black ops. The letters spelled out something we'd all feared: Project Meridian. I shouldn't have been surprised. The universe had a way of making private horrors public, of dragging old programs into the light when you were least prepared. Yet seeing Meridian's outlines, budget lines that swallowed entire colonies, notes on biological advantage, lists of hybrid candidates called from contact events, turned my stomach into a hollow bell. There were names on the list. Some I knew. Some had been erased. Some were marked acquired. And there, in a cramped column labeled Potential Integrators, my name stared back like a wound. "Eli," May whispered when she saw me go white. "We found resistance within human agencies. Some factions intend to weaponize hybrid traits. Meridian was a contingency to extract what we need and ensure dominance. They learned of Ulanite interest months ago. That's why Ajral accelerated contact." "You knew?" I asked, anger souring the shock. "You're the one who vouched for her." May's hands trembled. "I vouched for the science, not for political motives. I thought, naively, that transparency would protect us. The Meridian documents show how ugly this goes. If a faction cracks the genome first, they'll extract, replicate, and sell adaptive traits. The child would become an asset, not a person." The cabin seemed to tilt. The moral scaffolding we'd been building, tribunal oversight, guardians, Dr. May's independence, felt suddenly as brittle as glass. The possibility that Ajral's enemies within human ranks would seize the child before any covenant could bind them made my throat close. My refusal, once noble and simple, now looked like an abdication with consequences far beyond our freighter. I wanted to run. I wanted to tear the folder into pieces and pretend the politics outside our hull were someone else's mess. Instead, every memory of fingers that needed mending, of the Corin breach, of my mother's steady hands, anchored me. We had been offered an opportunity to change history, or a trap to be exploited. The difference rested on who controlled the narrative. That night, the crew split into factions, and the freighter's corridors felt like the deck plans of a warship. Jax wanted to fight, raid Meridian archives, expose the program to the galactic public, make enemies bleed in the open. Murphy's wanted to vanish, go live under the radar until the war blew over. Miri wanted guarantees and documents, an ethical framework that made the child visible as a person first. I listened more than I spoke because everything about the decision tasted like lead. Then Nav, our quiet scanner tech, came to me with a face like someone who had held a mirror to a liar. "Eli," he said, dropping a data chip into my palm, "you should see this." The chip contained footage, grainy, redacted, a warehouse on an off-world sprawl. Men in civilian clothes carried sealed crates. A child's cry leaked from the audio track, muffled and metallic. Documents in the footage tagged items as sample extraction and containment. Meridian's blue tape curled like a noose. We stared at the screen until the faces blurred. The knowledge that children, hybrid or otherwise, were being moved like cargo turned my stomach into fist after fist. The moral clarity I had tried to hold on to dissolved. It wasn't about me being chosen anymore. It was about whether I could live with the knowledge that my consent or my silence might feed an apparatus that ate beings for advantage. I sought Ajral in the little observation alcove Shed requested be left for me. The ship's window framed the black like an accusation. When she arrived, she moved in human form, but the filaments at the base of her skull trembled with something like grief. "You looked at Meridian," she said without ceremony. "You were part of that file," I answered. "You accelerated contact because human factions were sniffing. You pushed because you were afraid they'd choose a darker path. Is that why you came to me? To preempt them? Or to manipulate me?" Her silence was an ocean. "I feared," she said simply. "I feared the bureaucracy of choice. Meridian's agents have limbic access to resources I cannot immediately control. I had to act quickly to preserve what we could. I did not come to manipulate you, Eli Calder. I came because our survival required directness. But I do not deny that my haste may have made you feel used." Her words were honest and still did not repair the fracture. The gap between necessity and consent yawned like a chasm. I had expected diplomacy to be slick. I had not expected a ruler to admit fear. Admission helped, but it did not heal what had been broken. "You told me no edits," I said. "You promised no coercion. But your leaders, human or Olanate, have histories. Meridian proves that." Ajral's eyes, alien and luminous, hardened with a kind of sorrow that had nothing to do with monarchy and everything to do with a parent watching a species try to steady itself. "We cannot untangle history," she said, "but we can refuse to repeat it. I will bring witnesses. I will bind the covenant publicly. I will sever ties with those who would weaponize. But I cannot guarantee what every human faction will do. There are elements that operate beyond my influence." The bluntness of it was the cruelest part. Even if Ajral closed ranks, Meridian's networks were systemic, embedded in commerce and power. By agreeing to Ajral, I might place my child within a battleground where law and force clashed and where mercy was a negotiable item. By refusing, I might condemn a species to extinction as Meridian continued its cold calculus. I thought of Jax's teeth when he braced for a fight, of Miri's steady hands when she patched wounds and held newborns in shaky stations. I thought of my mother, of her stubborn insistence that you do right by your kin. None of the choices honored that insistence without inflicting harm elsewhere. The next sunrise, if sunrise could be called that through a hull, brought betrayal by way of radio. A voice on a classified frequency that had no business in our freighter's logs played a recording of my own voice, a private conversation, clipped and hung like bait. The message's owner had appended a flourish. "Mechanic Eli Calder is collaborating with Ajral, evidence enclosed." It was a smear, a political powder keg thrown at my feet. The crew gathered, eyes wide and faces drained. The recording had been doctored, the cadence unnatural in places, but the implication had weight. If Meridian could place false flags, then the battlefield included truth itself. Someone wanted us publicly tied to Ajral to force our hand or to make us pariahs. "Who benefits from that?" Jax barked. "Who profits from making you look complicit?" "Meridian," May said quietly, "or its sympathizers. They know the optics would force governments to act. If the public believes you are already allied with an alien queen, they justify aggressive seizure. They can claim national security." The realization sat like lead. We had to assume bad actors would weaponize narratives first and biology second. Consent could be stolen not just by sedation or edits, but by rumor, forged media, and the slow grind of public outrage. Meridian was not merely a program, it was a strategy that swallowed context and left bodies. In the days that followed, fractures widened. Miri refused to participate unless an independent biobank, one that pledged secrecy and legal protection. Jax considered a guerrilla strike to expose Meridian's holdings. Murphy's argued for stealth and moving the family off-grid. Nav threatened to leak Meridian's files to the public net if we were silenced. Trust eroded into suspicion. Small betrayals crept into the margins. Shouts behind closed doors. whispered plans kept from the council, someone loosening a bolt on a life support conduit as if to test loyalties. And then, the worst fracture of all. My mother received a question from an authority at a trade consulate. It was perfunctory and predatory, a polite-seeming query about possible associates and recent contacts with non-human entities. They had eyes on my family. The implication could not be cleaner. They would not hesitate to pull strings. The knowledge that my mother might be questioned, moved, used as leverage, made a sharp, physical ache in my chest. All the theoretical ethics crashed into the immediate, human fear of losing the person who had taught me to mend pipes and mend myself. My refusal to be used had become a decision that could endanger the people I loved. The crew looked to me, to the fulcrum that had started this chain. I was tired of being a hinge. I was tired of having the universe tilt on the axis of my choices. Standing in the corridor with the dossier in my hands, the evidence of Meridian's appetite for children like a stain on paper, I understood what Azrael had meant by urgency. I also understood why trust had splintered. In that moment, the choice was not between heroism and cowardice. It was between competing violences, between forms of betrayal and protection. There were no clean answers. I thought of the boy in the Corin breach and the oath I'd made, a small promise that had somehow become a lever to change two species' futures. The weight of it was crushing. I clenched the folder until the paper crinkled, and for the first time since the transmission, I felt the edges of my certainty fray into fear. The cracks were not just around us, they were within us. In every hand that could choose to cling to safety or to risk everything for an uncertain hope. The freighter felt suddenly very small, like a raft among predators. The crew's faces, lines carved by too many impossible choices, reflected back at me. We had to decide whether to trust an alien queen with a crown heavy with extinction, or to force Meridian into a light it had tried to avoid. Neither path promised safety. Both demanded sacrifice. And in the gap between them, relationships began to splinter. Alliances frayed, friendships cooled, and the tender thread of trust we had woven over years started to snap. The raid came at dusk, not with the cinematic roar I'd imagined, but with the soft, inexorable patience of pressure finding its crack. Meridian's operatives moved like cold water, precise and unblinking. Azrael's allies moved like tide, covering, diverting, making paths where none had existed. We were in the middle of it, a freighter with its ribs exposed, and for the first time, my hands felt useful for something that wasn't patching a pipe. We didn't plan heroics. We planned contingency, smart, dirty work that a salvage crew knew well. Misdirection, false manifests, channels that fed lies to men who believed only in profit. Jax drew up a list of targets, data caches that proved Meridian's shipments, a smuggling ledger that connected contractors with Meridian's front companies, and, dangerous, a sealed storage bay rumored to hold biological samples. Murphy's handled the engines. His fingers moved with the twitch of someone whose life had always been counted in maneuvers. Miri prepared medical contingencies, sedatives that couldn't be detected by Meridian's neural sweeps, triage kits, places to hide a child if it came to that. Azrael did not command with a crown. She moved with a fierce humility, an intensity that belonged to someone who had already lost entire generations. Her small envoy of filament-bearing guards worked the perimeter, their silvery forms braided into human clothing, blending in until they were needed. They were powerful and strange and unmistakably allied to her. When she looked at me before we left the freighter, there was no royal distance, only a woman waiting for another to choose to stand beside her. "We will be watching each other," she said. "If you fall, I will catch you. If I fall, you can still run. I ask not for blind trust, but for a shared will." I nodded, because nods are tools when words are inadequate. The first strike was information. Nav slipped into the net like a ghost and opened a path for us to send Meridian's invoices to the public flux. It took seconds for the story to spread. Photographs of crates, timestamps, names. Meridian's contractors could no longer pretend their hands were clean. The public outrage was immediate. It burned through polite denial and into political action. We watched the comm channels flood with denunciations. Meridian answered with denials and a smear campaign meant to make us forget the footage by drowning it in accusations. That was when they came for the storage bay. We moved in under a false manifest, a delivery of rusted engine parts bound for a private contractor. The security protocols were archaic in places, something Meridian's bureaucrats loved, and ruthless in others. The bay's door hummed a challenge, and then, for a breath, we were inside a tomb of chilled air and labeled boxes. The samples smelled like antiseptic and fear. At the center, behind ballistic glass, a sealed rack waited like a sacrament. We were ready to take names, to copy drives, to leave the place rearranged enough to make Meridian's tidy records look like a child's story. Then the alarms recalibrated. They had expected misdirection. They had not expected Azrael. Her guards folded filament into blades and light, and the security team found themselves under a pressure of grace that was also violence. I watched human faces go from smug to terrified to pleading. Meridian's men were not monsters. They were bureaucrats who made monstrous choices. Their eyes, as they scrambled, had the startled look of animals caught in a snare. We took what we could: drives, manifests, an encrypted core that contained shipment routes and buyer lists. But the sealed rack remained intact. Someone had moved it before we arrived. Meridian had a failsafe. On our way out, we found the child's crate empty, its latch yawning. My hands shook so hard that a bolt slipped from my fingers and clattered to the floor like a confession. Azrael's filaments quivered. The emptiness was an accusation. Meridian had been faster than we'd anticipated. The crate's logs showed a transfer, time-stamped and fraudulent, and a transfer route that led to a Meridian-run medical facility on a near-moon with diplomatic immunity. It was the worst possible outcome, and the only one that felt inevitable. The child, or the sample, or the living thing Meridian hunted, was somewhere under the protection of a program that saw life as leverage. Rage burned like a fever in the crew. Jax wanted to storm the facility with nothing but torque wrenches and bravado. Murphy's wanted to run and hide until the heat died. Miri wanted procedure and law. I wanted my mother safe and my hands steady. Azrael looked at me, and in her gaze there was a decision I hadn't expected to have to make. A queen asking a mechanic to choose between diplomacy and violence. "We can petition," she said. "We can open this to tribunals, to public oversight, but Meridian will bury it under legalities. Or we can take the facility by force. It will burn bridges. It will make enemies that do not forgive." I felt the shape of what sacrifice might be then, like a tool I had to pick up whether I wanted to or not. The freighter was not a warship, but our lives had taught us improvisation. We could not sit and wait while Meridian clicked its teeth over a child's crib. The ethical calculus shifted. Diplomacy could secure long-term protections, but it could also allow Meridian to bury the living under jurisdictional rot. Force could free a child, but leave us fugitives hunted by every authority that liked its teeth. "I will go," I said. The words surprised me. Their solidity felt like a new bone forming. Not because I'm brave, because no law will ever replace the sole fact that a child is being held. Azrael's filaments tightened around her shoulders, a ripple of fear and relief. "If you go, you will not go alone," she said. "And you must understand what you risk. Meridian will respond in kind. Your family—" Her voice broke. "They will be targets." I thought of my mother's stooped hands, of Jack's cussedness, of Mira's gentle brutality. I thought of the boy in the Corin breach and the oath I'd made. "Then let me be the one who takes the risk," I said. Let me be the hinge. We struck at night. Ajral's allies created a diversion, broadcasting falsified outbreak reports that pulled Meridian's supply lines thin. Nav jammed the facility's cams long enough for us to slip inside. We moved like thieves, with a precision born of salvage runs and heartbeats timed to the hum of a ship. Inside, the facility reeked of antiseptic and intent. Rooms were locked with bureaucracy and with fear. Meridian's staff had training that made them efficient, but they lacked the improvisational grit of a crew whose lives had been defined by salvage. We found the child in a medical suite behind a curtain of glass that made the small body look both fragile and defiant. It was not a baby as I knew babies. Its skin had saffron tones and faint filament scars where Ulanat biotech had met human tissue. It slept, and the monitor chirped a rhythm like a body's small, invincible song. When I looked down, something unbent in me. A softness so profound I felt like a cup being filled. The Meridian guards converged as alarms blared. We had minutes. I could see the calculation flicker in Ajral's eyes. Extraction, then escape, then the knowledge we might be hunted for the rest of our lives. Dr. May moved with surgical speed, soothing the child, packing meds and data drives into a satchel. Miri stood like a shield, hands steady. Jax and Murphys worked lines. Nav handled the exit vector. We did not get clean away. Meridian had anticipated escape and had forces waiting in the corridors. Gunfire sang like a chorus of metallic rain. Ajral's guards moved with filaments unfurled, bending light and tearing through walls. They did not kill indiscriminately. They incapacitated, in colors and pressure that felt like mercy and violence braided together. I was in the middle of it, thrust forward by a terrible, earnest love for something that did not belong to me, but that had lodged in me anyway. In the chaos, a collateral collapsed the corridor behind us. A weight of debris pinned Ajral's envoy. A hydraulic scream cut through my chest. One of her filaments, beautiful, agonizing, had wrapped around a beam and then around the envoy's wrist. Ajral looked back at me, eyes wide, with a need I understood like prayer. "Take the child," she urged, voice raw. "Go." I could not leave her. Not then. Not after everything. I shoved the satchel toward Dr. May, who took it with shaking hands. Miri and Jax forced the child toward the exit. Murphys shoved me and hissed, "Go." Ajral moved then in a way that tore the air. She used her filaments to lift the beam, to free her envoy, and in the moment the corridor cleared, she reached for me. Her fingers were warm, alien and human at once. "Stay with me," she said, as if the mercy in that command might be a life raft. "Stay and claim the covenant with me, or go and let our child grow without the danger of kings at your back." There was no clean answer. I thought of my mother. I thought of the child bundled in Dr. May's arms, of Meridian's files leaking to the public, of the tribunal that could bind promises into law. Ajral's hand closed around mine, filament and palm, offer and plea braided together. To stay would be to give myself publicly to a queen and to risk my family. To go would be to take a child into an uncertain exile and leave Ajral to wage war alone. I stepped into choice with the clumsiness of someone whose life had been about mending rather than marching. "I will not let our child be weaponized," I said. "I will stand with you in public, not as a symbol, but as a witness. I will give my name to tribunal if it means the child is safe. But I will not let them use the child's body as leverage. I choose us, but not at the cost of turning a child into a tool." Ajral's eyes closed for a breath, and when she opened them again, the filaments braided into something like armor and embrace. "Then we bind it," she said, "publicly, witnessed, with your family placed under protection, with Meridian exposed, together." We fought our way out, ragged and furious, with Meridian's men howling behind us and Ajral's filaments weaving paths. We paid for the extraction, scars, mechanical losses, a fugitive status that would follow us like a shadow. But the child was alive, and when Dr. May unwrapped a small fist that closed around her finger with a human grip, I felt my world shift in a way bolts never could. The public exposure did more than anger. It forced accountability in a way hostage deals never could. Meridian's contractors flailed under scrutiny as tribunal investigators descended, anger amplified into policy. Ajral, courageous and exposed, signed the covenant in a plaza where humans and Ulanate watched, and I signed beside her, my name crooked and small, but truthful. The guardians we demanded were placed, mixed contingents of tribunal peacekeepers and Ulanate shields. Legal protections were hammered into documents and left brittle and unenforceable. The cost was real. We burned bridges. Some of the crew could not bear the public heat and left to vanish into the outer lanes. My mother was moved into an enclave for protection, which felt like both safety and exile. Meridian's tendrils receded but did not die. Enemies form in the dark, and the shadow of them would follow. Ajral's people gained time to secure enzyme pathways and to build the colony that might shelter both kinds of children. The child, our child, if we would later call them that, was named not by crown or by contract, but by consensus. Lyra, a word that meant both seed and promise in Olanite root. In the quiet hour after the tribunal's signatures had cooled, Ajral and I stood on the freighter's small observation deck. The child slept in a guarded cradle below, breathing like the future itself. We did not speak of politics then. We spoke of small things: the sound of a rusted hinge, the taste of coffee in a station kitchen, the smell of rain on recycled air. We were two beings who had been thrust into impossible roles and who had chosen, in the end, to be deliberate about what kind of saviors we would be. "You could have left," she said finally, her voice a filament of light. "I could have," I admitted, "but I couldn't walk away and call myself honest." She smiled, a flash of colors that didn't fit human smiles and fitted them anyway. "Honesty is a dangerous thing in your species," she said. "It is also beautiful." We sealed the covenant with a kiss that was less royal ceremony than bargain between equals. Two people who had been broken by politics and rebuilt by choice. The moment was not a cure for everything. Meridian still whispered on the edges, and the tribunal had more battles ahead. But in that kiss there was. As all of this mind-boggling thoughts were reflected back against the audience, the realization hit them like a ton of bricks. Human consciousness is a marvel that can't be simply articulated. It involves an intricate system of emotions, beliefs, and language, all shaping our experience of the world. That's why we humans have such a difficult time communicating our feelings. We try to find or create the language to express our innermost thoughts, but the barriers always remain.